After the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013, the GOP essentially found this as a green light to essentially pass suppression laws in the various Republican-controlled states. One of these processes was Interstate Crosscheck. Now, Interstate Crosscheck was a way of purging 1.1 million voters under this guise of voter fraud, the ubiquitous voter fraud. Voter fraud is all over the place. The irony of this is and maybe it's not irony, but we keep hearing about these Russians. We keep hearing about Russian propaganda, Russian putting Facebook and Twitter ads. But no one is ever really engaging the reality that millions of Americans were being scrubbed for the voter rolls, not by something that's outside of our state, but by things that were taking place internally, the internal processes. In this case, Republicans. Don't get me wrong. During the Democratic primary, Democrats engaged in the same policies, which is why I don't necessarily have that much sympathy for them in the main election. But let's be honest, that gaming the system has become part of the political process, and it needs to stop. Interstate Crosscheck was a way of purging millions of voters under the ubiquitous, non-existent voter fraud. Just to make the point clear, take a look at this. Comprehensive study from 2014 published in the Washington Post found 31 credible instances of impersonation fraud, which is what the Republican laws of crossing people and purging off the list does. I mean, ultimately, Interstate Crosscheck will go through and say, hey, there's a guy named Hernandez in this state, and there's another guy named Hernandez in this state. Let's cross that guy off the list because that guy, that guy could be the same guy. We don't want that guy voting twice. Well, the catch of it is, when you look at the data, African Americans, Asians, Hispanics were overrepresented in the numbers of people that were scrubbed off the voting list. That wasn't an act of God, that was intentional. All for this thing of voter fraud, which doesn't exist. 31 credible instances of impersonation fraud from 2000 to 2014 out of more than 1 billion ballots cast. Even this tiny number is likely inflated, as the study's author counted not just prosecutions or convictions, but any and all credible claims. Think about that. Out of 1 billion ballots, 31 credible instances. And even those is probably inflated. And with that information, Republicans went carte blanche, purging millions of eligible American voters. And let's be honest, they purged voters that they knew wasn't going to vote for them. To make this clear and make this plain, Interstate Crosscheck, in Trump, I've shown this before, Trump's victory margin in Michigan is 13,000. Michigan Crosscheck purge list, 449,000. Trump's victory margin in Arizona, 85,000. Crosscheck in Arizona, 270,000. Trump's margin in victory in North Carolina, 177,000. Purge list, 589,000. It wasn't the Russians. If you're going to look anywhere for shenanigans that went beyond the electoral system, it wasn't the Russians. The problem is in your society itself. The problem is not external to your society. I am not saying that foreign adversaries don't necessarily try to, influence things. I'm making the point that the direct influence is internal to your country. That's where you need to look. The person who was in charge and led this, Kris Kobach. Kris Kobach was sanctioned by a judge and rebuked, not necessarily calling him incompetent, and she didn't go so far as to call him corrupt. I will go so far as to call him corrupt because they're putting these things in place knowing that the voter fraud doesn't exist, but doing that as a pretext so they can game the system to allow them better chances around the margins to win. you can make an honest case that Trump won this election because of Interstate Crosscheck. Judge tosses Kansas proof of citizenship voter law and rebukes Secretary of State Kris Kobach. Chief District Judge Julie A. Robinson sanctioned Kobach, who led President Trump's voter fraud commission, which is Orwellian in and of itself, by ordering him to take a legal class on the rules of evidence or procedure. Kobach represented his office and was the lead attorney in the case. The judge said Kobach failed to show that there had been a substantial number of people who managed to register to vote in Kansas without being U.S. citizens. Of course he managed not to show that, because that wasn't the point. The point was to scrub X number of people off the voting list to give his person a better chance of winning. Kobach is running for governor of the state of Kansas. He is in a dead heat with Laura Kelly. A new poll unveiled in a governor's race on Tuesday shows little separation between Republican Kris Kobach and Democrat Laura Kelly. The survey of the public policy polling firm conducted October last Wednesday through Sunday saw Kelly and Kobach registered at 41%, with independent Greg Orman at 10% and libertarian Jeff Caldwell at 2%. The poll, with a 3.7% margin of error, shows 6% were undecided. According to the same poll, in a two-way race between Kelly and Kobach, Kelly holds a 4-point lead, while 8% are undecided. The midterm that could shift power in Washington, D.C. and would determine Kansas' next governor is set for November 6th. In the context of this race, dead heat, close, the governorship up for grabs, voter suppression, overt, blunt. At a time when many rural voters are slowly dying, the arrival of two massive meatpacking plants boosted Dodger City economy and transforms its demographics as immigrants from Mexico and other countries flooded to fill those jobs. We're talking about a city in Kansas. But the city, located 160 miles from Wichita, has only one polling site for its 27,000 residents. Since 2002, the lone site was a civic center just blocks from the local country club in the wealthy white part of town. For this November's election, local officials have moved it out of the city limits of facility more than a mile from the nearest bus stop, citing construction that blocked the previous site. You're talking about a voting precinct, 27,000 residents, one polling location. Many of the residents are poor. Many of the residents are not necessarily all that well off. And it's understood that there's going to be a percentage of those residents that is not going to be able to make that trip, does not want to make that trip, maybe does not want to stand in that line, seeing as you have 27,000 residents. Let's keep going. It is shocking that we only have one polling place, but that is the kind of scratching the surface of the problem. Johnny Dunlap, chairman of the Ford County Democratic Party. On top of that, not only is it irrational and ridiculous that we have only one polling place, but Dodge City is one of the few minority-majority cities in the state. I would argue that the reason you have only one polling location is because you are a majority in the state, and it is to limit the number of people of your particular demographic, knowing that that demographic typically votes Democrat, from voting. This is voter suppression at its finest. A Democratic Party database compiled from the voter state data shows Hispanic turnout during non-presidential elections is just 17% compared to 61% turnout for white voters in Ford County in 2014. Dodger City turnout is below the national rate of 27% among Latino eligible voters in 2014, which is in and of itself a record low that year for the country, according to the Pew Research Center. Here's the thing. Well, right here. The single polling site services more than 13,000 voters in Dodger City area compared to the average of 1,200 voters per polling site at other locations. This is done to make long lines, to make voting a miserable process. If you don't have a car, how are you going to get to the voting location? Are you going to walk to the voting location when there is no bus stop near the voting location? It is done to shave off as many people as you can off the voting list. In a race that's a dead heat, that may choose or decide the governorship, any percentage of voter that you can shave off helps you win that race. This is within the context of of Georgia shaving off hundreds of thousands of voters. And I'm making a point here that why is your society making voting difficult? And is that something that should be made difficult? I don't care whether you're a Republican. I don't care whether you're a Democrat. I don't care whether you're somewhere in between. Why is your society making voting difficult? And shouldn't voting be sacrosanct? One man, one woman, one vote. It should not be a difficult process. If you're Hispanic, if you're black, if you're a woman, if you're whatever you are, if you're an American, God bless you. Your birthright is your vote. And we should protect that with our lives. The idea that 27,000 people only get one polling location, I make the point to you that is done for a reason to suppress and make it difficult for people to vote. And moving the polling location to somewhere where there is not a bus stop, when there's, again, one polling location for 27,000 people, when the typical number of voters, average, is 1,200 per precinct, is a clear, unvarnished case of voter suppression. During the election, during the primary, in situations where Bernie Sanders was going to, open primaries, what did they do? They shut down the polling locations because they wanted to make it difficult for people to vote. You had a hard time finding the location. Once you had to find the location, you had to stand in line for an hour. It creates a disincentive for people to vote. I suggest to you that the same thing is happening here. This should not be allowed in what's supposed to be the greatest democracy on the planet. It's not the goddamn Russians. This is purely internal processes in our country. And whether you're black, white, gay, straight, Democrat, Republican, independent, somewhere in between, your birthright should be your vote. Voter fraud is a myth. We should protect our vote. I'm not going to keep this one long because there's not a huge amount here, but it is very possible that the guy who led Interstate Crosscheck loses. Kobach right now is Secretary of State in Kansas. He is running for the governorship. The Secretary of State position, right off the bat, has a certain degree of power associated with it in regards to the voting apparatus. Something similar is taking place in Georgia, where a person who's trying to put 900,000 more eligible voters onto the voting list is running against somebody who's trying to get rid of hundreds of thousands of people from the voting list. If your plan in getting elected is getting rid of voters, then there's something wrong with you and there's something wrong with your platform. Is this really what we want? If the goal of a democracy is one man, one woman, one vote, we take a poll and we go. If that is what it is, then this idea of scrubbing people off the voting list is antithetical to anything of what it means to be an American, at least in the schoolboy idea of what it means to be an American. I'll end this here. I'm not going to keep this long, but I'm putting the links at the bottom so you can see for yourself. It's not the goddamn Russians. It's us and its internal processes in this country itself. I'll end it here. Thanks all.